So welcome to the Economic History Society conference at Cambridge. I'm Romola Davenport. I'm the local organiser for the conference this year, and one of the privileges of that office is to choose the plenary speaker, and I was really pleased when Gareth accepted my invitation. So Gareth has held the chair in economic history in Cambridge since 2016, when he moved to Cambridge from Geneva, where he held a distinguished chair in the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies. Between 1998 and 2010, he taught in the Department of Economic History at LSE, and he also taught for 3 years at the University of Ghana. Gareth's work on African and comparative global economic history has made major contributions to the renaissance of both subjects in the last 2 decades. He's published extensively on the economic and social history of Ghana and of West Africa more broadly, and he's made major contributions to a number of key debates in global economic history, including Lewis's thesis regarding labour-intensive industrialisation, and Acemoglu, Johnson and Robinson's reversal of fortunes thesis regarding the differential outcomes of European colonisation of densely versus sparsely populated regions. So his scholarship's not only geographically and chronologically expansive, but it's also broad in methodology. So he navigates deftly and diplomatically between quantitative and econometric approaches on the one hand, which has made African economic history much more accessible to many economic historians, and more social, historical and anthropological methods that remain integral to arguably all history, but particularly African history. And in addition to his scholarly contributions, he played a really key enabling role in promoting African and global history. But that would take too long to document all his contributions. So tonight he's making another contribution to a major debate on the roles of land abundance and labour in the development of slavery. So Gareth's going to speak for about 30 minutes, and then there'll be time for a few questions afterwards. But we need to be prompt for dinner. They were very strict about that. So thank you very much, Gareth.
Thank you very much, Romola. Thank you very much, Romola, and also for your heroic efforts in enabling this conference to happen, which we'll no doubt thank you again later. I'm going to talk about a familiar subject in a perhaps unfamiliar region, though it's not unfamiliar to everybody in the audience, I'm glad to say. And in doing so, I want to try to revive a discredited theory, which I think works very well, albeit with some extensions, for the region I'm talking about, in the period I'm talking about, which is mainly 17th to 19th century. That, of course, if you believe me, will then raise the problem of how you integrate it with other parts of the world where it may not work so well. So, what is slavery? It has a number of distinctive characteristics. And one, very important one, is that it is generally the fate of outsiders. It's foreigners who become slaves in the first generation, and thereafter, if they are continued to be regarded as slaves, they will continue to be seen as, in some sense, outsiders. And West Africa is no exception to that very broad generalization. So almost all first generation slaves were brought as captives from wars or raids. African societies did not enslave their own populations, with tiny exceptions that I'd be happy to discuss. The second thing is, arising logically from the first, slaves are kinless. They have no kin in the society into which they have been forcibly brought. And the third is that they are extremely powerless, at least in principle, though there are questions about that, including whether that is really quite so distinctive to slaves as opposed to, for example, prisoners. And of course, prisoners have been a huge source of coerced labour in the 20th century at least. Finally, slavery is the most, it seems to me, is the most market-oriented of all the forms of coerced labour. I mean, the clue is in the term slave trade. So for me, the logical definition for West Africa is the old one, that ultimately a slave is somebody who could be bought in law. So it's not one of those cases of serfs being illegally sold in Tsarist Russia. And in practice, there's also a realistic possibility that they would be sold, at least under certain circumstances. That definition, I have to say, I don't think works for the whole of Africa. I found myself adopting a broader definition when I tried to encompass Zambia. But for West Africa, I think, fortunately for economic historians, it does work. That is the cover of the first edition of a book that Cambridge University Press conveniently reprinted in digital format in 2010. I think unjustly neglected. Sorry, this one needs extra viciousness. No, it doesn't. Yes. It's an idea, the Niebuhr-Domar hypothesis is an idea that could be described as new institutionalist before the name. And it goes back even further to the writings of Gibbon Wakefield, who cheekily entitled his essay on how the ruling classes should organise the colonisation of New Zealand to avoid the awful possibility that lots of free people will be let loose on lots of free land, allowing nobody to exploit anybody. That was written not from Sydney, but from an English jail. Niebuhr and Domar are the better known ones, and I do commend Niebuhr, whose book has a great deal more ideas in it than Domar's excellent, very useful synthesis, but after all, it was a very short article. So, important to say, despite the title of Domar's article, neither of them thought that their hypothesis could explain sufficiently the existence of slavery. Both of them recognized that a purely economic explanation cannot explain a phenomenon based on violence. So rather, it's about explaining the conditions, specifying the conditions under which slavery would be, or more precisely, labor coercion of any sort, would be profitable for the coercer. They defined those circumstances in terms of aggregate factor ratios, the abundance of land in relation to labor, and assuming that capital is scarce in relation to both. So they thought that you would not have much slavery in pastoral societies, because of course the cows are a form of capital. And they also assumed that scale economies were absent or negligible. And hence you get the famous Domar trilemma about which Wakefield worried. So let me come to criticisms. There are three major criticisms I want to mention, which I will come back to at the end. The first is the proposition that it's a very reductive approach, simply because politics can change everything. Governments can make land expensive, even where it's physically abundant. The second criticism, specifically in an African context, is that slavery in Africa was actually more social than economic. It was primarily about assimilating strangers. And my own major approach to the theory is that it's underdetermined, that neither Niebuhr nor Domar can tell you whether it's going to be slavery or serfdom. And the same, by the way, applies to a more recent theory that I mentioned there. I'm now going to argue that West Africa in this period did indeed meet the conditions that Niebuhr and Domar were talking about. In all those respects, I'm going to say a bit more about labor and land. So low population density is generally agreed. However, if we wanted to move beyond contemporary observations and also archaeological evidence to numbers, then we're stuck with backward projection from 20th century censuses, which is a necessary but clearly very unreliable task. As of the 1990s, 2000s, Pat Manning's 1990 book provided, I think, the most widely accepted guesstimate, and it came in at a third or a quarter of the population density of non-European Russia. More recently, there's been a revival of the debate about pre-colonial and indeed colonial population densities, with Pat Manning thinking that he earlier underestimated pre-colonial populations because he took the wrong censuses, and Frankema and Yervin arguing in response that the truth is probably somewhere in between the two. The main point for today's purpose is to say it doesn't actually make any difference. Even if Pat Manning is right, it wouldn't alter the argument that labour was relatively scarce in relation to land. Pat doesn't agree, but I would strongly argue that. What really matters anyway for the hypothesis is not population density as such, but relative scarcity. And here's a quotation from the Scottish explorer Mungo Park, visiting what is now Senegambia and Mali at the end of the 18th century, where he puts this very well. Few people work harder than when occasion demands. But basically, what you see in that quote is that the amount of land under cultivation is a function of the labour inputs. And in this particular area, there was clearly a demand constraint. So only a certain amount of labour goes in, and the rest of the land is left uncultivated. A quantitative example from the early 20th century I give from one of the more densely populated areas with 2 or 3 times the average West African population density, quite close to the capital of a major state. And as of 1907, a lot of the land was left completely outside a land rotation cycle of 15 to 20 years. So you might immediately ask, well, if that's all true, why on earth was it privately possible, let alone possible, profitable, sensible from the point of view of a state, why was it even privately possible for there to be an external slave trade, or to be precise too, including the Saharan one? And there's a lot that could be said on that, but I think one large part of it is the marginal product of labour. The marginal product of labour of Africans, even enslaved, must have been higher in market terms, not necessarily in physical terms, in the parts of the world to which they were brought as labourers. And that, in turn, I think, reflects major environmental constraints upon agriculture, upon transport, and upon manufacturing. I mean, just one example would be the prevalence in the forest zones in much of the savannah of trypanosomiasis, the animal form of sleeping sickness, so nothing to pull your plough other than yourself. What about the outcomes? I think these two actually reflect support the hypothesis that wage labour was vanishingly rare, that there were other forms of labour coercion around, of which debt bondage was the most widespread, and slave trading was by far the most common way of recruitment into a household or into a royal court of additional labourers. So here's a quote from Mungo Park, making a generalisation which actually was incorrect, but it's mostly right for West Africa. If we come to the very end of the 19th century, there are various estimates of the percentage of the population of various societies in West Africa, the percentage that was composed of slaves. There are also some earlier estimates. If we go to the very end of the 19th century, there is the advantage, it's a genuine advantage, that the French did try to count, though really it's estimates. But the advantage of the French West Africa for this purpose is that it was a mixture of different kinds of ecology, different kinds of social context. And the figure that emerges is that about 30% of the population, either in 1905 or at the time of conquest, depending on how you interpret it, were slaves. There are earlier estimates for other regions which are actually higher, and indeed for parts of French West Africa. So the most important one would be for by far the largest state in 19th century West Africa, known to historians as the Sokoto Caliphate, which occupied, if you follow the news from Africa, the whole of northern Nigeria, except for the part where Boko Haram are active today, and also going over into neighbouring countries as they now are. And its latest historian, Mohammed Salou, thinks that over half the population were enslaved as of 1850, and the numbers would only be going up for reasons I'll come to in a second. I tend to think the more plausible estimates are the lower ones, partly just because of the sheer limits on state capacity and indeed social capacity to constrain the population, and also because I suspect that the highest figures include people who wouldn't actually meet the criteria, meet my definition of a slave, because they might be of slave descent, but they had been assimilated with some rights in the population. So when did all this happen? There is the view that it's been true for hundreds of years, put forward by John Thornton in a number of distinguished works. The view of the majority, and I count myself among that majority, tends to follow the view first articulated by Walter Rodney, but really developed in detail by Paul Lovejoy, which has come to be known as the transformation thesis, that there was very little slavery in West Africa as of 1500, and that it expanded as a joint product with external slave trades. And so in the case of the Atlantic trade, the archetype would be male captives would be shipped off to the Americas. Female captives were much more likely to be retained in Africa, bearing in mind there was a 2-to-1 majority of males among those embarked for the Americas. The biggest increase comes in the 19th century, and there was a lot of evidence from all sorts of monographs reflecting primary sources that an awful lot of slaves were being imported, not everywhere, but in most 19th century societies. And logically, that can't have been going at the same rate in the previous 200 years. Otherwise, it would be a lot more than 50% even by 1900. But also, it really reflects the fact that the era of the internal and external demand for slavery being served by a joint production process was increasingly over following 1807. And the abolition of the British withdrawal from the slave trade, followed by bullying other slave trading countries into doing likewise. The other thing about the 19th century is that you have a growth in demand for commodities produced within West Africa, from which a demand for extra labor is derived. Partly the Atlantic so-called legitimate commerce, producing anything other than slaves, notably palm oil and groundnuts or peanuts, to serve the markets expanded by the industrialization of Western Europe. And the other is the growth of interregional markets, of which the Sokoto Caliphate was the main one. I mean, the Sokoto Caliphate was thoroughly religiously motivated, but it did actually create a single market over a vast area. And it certainly protected the property rights of slave owners and of traders. And its textile industry served pretty much the whole of West Africa. And its raw materials, both cotton and dyes, vegetable dyes, were basically all produced on slave plantations. So perhaps I should point out, here's the Sokoto Caliphate. I'll also mention Asante, so that land, example of land being abundant came from about there. And Mungo Park came in sort of roughly there, and indeed visited up to there. Another thing that helped the growth of 19th century slave ownership in West Africa was clearly the withdrawal of much of the overseas demand. So exactly as you would predict, the price of slaves peaked in 1807 and fell actually by 2/3 by the mid-1810s. Then there is a revival to about 2/3 of the 1807 level. And it seems to me the only plausible explanation for that sustained revival across the region as a whole is increased purchases of captives by people from within the region. So I will go on to argue that slave labor was profitable, and you can see that in various respects which I mentioned here, and certainly slave owners behaved as if it was profitable because they kept reinvesting. So here's a number of reports, which are not based on a single observation, but of the prices in a particular area at a particular time, or of a few years, for how much labor it would take a free individual to earn enough cash to buy a slave at the prevailing price. And you see that in terms of months, it's not very long. The apparent contrast between reports of 1 or 1.25 months and 15 months, or even, 15 months. A lot of that actually is really to do with the fact that that earning cash was largely confined to the dry season. During the rainy season, you were mostly occupied in food farming, not for the market. So I suspect that actually, in all cases, what you needed is anything from 1 to 3 dry seasons to be able to afford to buy a human being if that's what you plan to do. There are a rather larger number of reports of how long it took for slave owners to recoup, at least in gross terms, the cost of a slave. And on the whole, it's a few years. It's a bit longer because slaves probably didn't work quite as hard as free workers did in producing for their master, but not very long. So for the enslavers, certainly I would argue it was efficient as an investment. Note towards the bottom that in West Africa, it was very common for slaves to be allowed 1 or sometimes 2 days a week to work for themselves. That's partly because it saved the owner having to provide for their subsistence, but it was also a kind of implicit concession, to which I'll return in a second. Niebuhr and Domar don't have quite the same view, and the Niebuhr hypothesis was introduced to West Africa by Tony Hopkins in 1973, and he very much applied what I would call the less extreme version of the model, in which wage labor was realistic, but slave labor was cheaper. Whereas in a book I wrote on Asante, it seemed to me very clear that there was basically no such thing as wage labor in 19th century Asante, and that was the only market was the market in slaves. Essentially, there was no wage rate, that it was in the mutual interest of potential employer and potential worker to accept. So I go with Domar in that sense. Pastoralism, the expectation of the hypothesis is correct, at least for West Africa. For example, the Tuareg didn't actually have many slaves in their society, except at salt mines in the Sahara, where everybody would be a slave, for the very simple reason that they were abandoned there to dig salt, and there was no prospect of getting out. The Domar hypothesis, the Domar version of the hypothesis, was actually put very neatly by a petition of chiefs from one part of Asante saying to the British government, please don't abolish slavery, as we have no money like Europeans to hire men to do necessaries for us. Now, it wasn't a currency problem, it was simply a lack of purchasing power. Perhaps I'll skip that. So what about the criticisms? 3 criticisms and 3 responses. The first is, it's obviously the case that in principle states could use their coercive power to make land artificially expensive, or institutionally expensive would be a better word. However, it's not costless to do that. So it seems to me that it shouldn't be difficult to extend the framework to specify conditions under which it will be in the interests of the ruling class to either choose no coercion or to choose a particular form of coercion. So in this case, a big problem for masters was the limited coercive capacity of states and even more of stateless societies. I mean, you did have slaves in most stateless societies even, and as you'd expect, it was the strongest states that had the largest number of slaves, largest proportions of slaves. But even so, coercive capacity is a problem. If that's the case, why would you even dream of trying to subordinate the whole of your free population when you could invite your free population to join with you in exploiting outsiders? Second criticism from lots of historians of Africa, the majority of whom do accept the kind of social rather than the economic interpretation of West African slavery. My view is that these two supposedly rival interpretations are both compatible and actually interdependent, because only the economic can really explain the motivation for the great growth of slavery in the 19th century. It can also, only the economic can explain the purchasing power that made that possible. But it was necessary for masters to make concessions to slaves, both short-term, viz. Have a day a week to work for yourself, and if you do have time to earn any cash, you can keep it, and long-term, namely, your descendants will be treated better than you will and will have some rights. There's actually enormous variation in that, but I don't have time to go into it. But it's also true that assimilation was by no means universal nor unqualified. The irony about assimilation, of course, is that it reinforced the slave trade, because if you can't exploit the second generation's labour to the same degree that as you exploited the first generation, a master would need to get more slaves. The third criticism, the one that I have a lot of sympathy with, that it's underdetermined. Again, it seems to me it would be possible to expand the framework to take account of some of this. Jack Goody said 50 years ago that unfree tenancies mean little unless land is highly valued and your peasantry has nowhere to go. And he was thinking of exactly this question of why you didn't have serfdom in West Africa. High quality land, of course, is compatible with slavery. You only have to think of the Americas, but that is a case in which basically the slaves had nowhere else to go. In West Africa, there is actually one very convenient exception to the generalization about the predominance of slavery as opposed to other forms of coercion. And that is the Niger Bend in what is now Mali, where during the days of the Songhai Empire, which was overthrown in 1591 by a Moroccan invasion, there were a lot of estates along the river banks. And curiously, in the English language literature, these are always referred to as run by slaves. In the French literature, they're referred to as operated by serfs. And I think the French are right. But that actually makes sense, because this was land that was exceptionally fertile. And the sustainability of that fertility was very high. So I think this is one case where the subordinated workers really were tied to the land rather than being slaves as elsewhere. So I would suggest that higher, more sustainable land quality favours serfdom. The opposite favours slavery within the framework of a choice of different systems of coerced labour, providing that the peasantry, for want of a better word, have some means of escape, or don't have some means of escape. Okay, so that's that. As you've gathered, I hope, I do think that this much criticised and often considered discredited hypothesis is still valuable. I particularly think it works for West Africa, though it does require extensions in various respects. Thank you very much.
Hi, great talk. You started with a definition which had outsider, the slave as an outsider in a settled society, and that outsider identity was I found very fascinating, and that implies that migration, forced or unforced, maybe induced by droughts or famines, would have an agency in the process that creates slaves and slave trade. It's environmental, but it has nothing to do with factory endowments. If you have a high frequency of droughts in an environment, you could have this outcome. What do you think about that? I mean, why doesn't that figure in the rest of the story?
Yeah, I didn't include outsiders in the actual definition. I'd see it as a characteristic of slavery, but I don't see it as the defining feature. I mean, that may be simply because I try to have just one criterion for definition. But during this era, there was a pronounced pattern of certain slave routes along which people who'd already been captured were sold from owner to owner, from trader to trader, gaining in value the further they were taken from their home. And interestingly, that pattern is pretty close to the pattern of free migrant labour in the 20th century, when circumstances had changed, and certainly, in my view, the development of more lucrative cash crop farming enabled masters to make the transition to becoming employers. And the workers they were hiring did tend to be migrant labourers from a long distance. And there was certainly an ecological difference. In other words, you migrated from areas typically in the Sahel, short of rain, where either you didn't have the conditions to grow the more lucrative cash crops, or if you did, you were too far from mechanized transport or the sea. So I certainly think that's a very important aspect, and that reinforces a point that I hinted at but didn't make explicit, that whereas the Nibel-Demar hypothesis operates at the level of aggregate factors, it's very important to distinguish issues of land quality, which of course is a lot to do with rainfall.
That was really, really interesting. I obviously speak from almost total ignorance. But I'm wondering about why population remains so low in a situation where slaves can be so productive in the sense that you're talking about. I appreciate the subtleties of the hypothesis. And to what extent is the low population levels that you see a function of slavery, a demographic consequence of enslavement, and perhaps its impact on the capacity of population to rise in the way that you might anticipate, particularly in the 19th century when there are tradable goods in these areas? You know, is there anything in that, or is that ignorance manifest?
Certainly not the latter. I would say a few things. One is that West Africa's generally been considered to be well within its population carrying capacity until the late 20th century. So, for example, the point at which land, the physical and even institutional supply of land becomes a constraint upon production, depending on where you're talking about, often that wasn't until the last decade or two of the 20th century or even later. So, I mean, how to explain that? I think one would need to look at disease patterns in particular, because the big fall in mortality rates and the beginnings of sustained growth of population didn't happen until the 1920s, certainly not until after the 1918 influenza pandemic. So it wasn't transformed by, for example, the arrival of a few European doctors. Indeed, you could argue that the warfare that accompanied colonization was a negative influence upon population. I do think slave trading, or rather slave exporting, constrained population growth, may even have reduced the population in some areas, though this is a surprisingly difficult thing to demonstrate. I mean, at the time of the first half-reliable censuses, the more densely populated areas, if anything, tended to be those, notably southeast Nigeria, from which particularly large numbers of people were embarked as slaves. But there are other areas like the middle belt of Nigeria, which is generally accepted as having been partly depopulated in that era. And you certainly see parts of West Africa that in the post-Atlantic slave trade era, you see local depopulations with lots of destroyed villages, particularly when Samori Touré was fighting against the French and capturing slaves and selling them to the Ashantis and others in order to finance his operations.
Thank you, Gareth, for the excellent talk. I really learned a lot from that. So besides the political and the economic reasons, I'm also wondering about the social norms and culture as well as the religious impact on the slavery in West Africa. Thank you.
One general point is that, as many people have pointed out, the real peculiar institution in terms of world history is free wage labor rather than slavery. It's extremely widespread as a historical phenomenon. But more generally, I think Africanists rightly would see this as part of a wider pattern of property rights in people. And by the way, this is picked up by Niebuhr, who discusses the question of husbands' rights in relation to wives. And he generally thinks that husbands can only need to resort to external labour coercion if they can't get enough free labour from within the household. And you've got pawning. I mean, the main way of getting a large loan was to offer a junior relative in pawn or yourself. So pawning is not a fate of outsiders, it's a fate of insiders. It's got to be your heir or somebody from your family, generally speaking. But I think there was a very widespread acceptance of property rights in people. This does not mean that every society accepted slavery, but the exceptions do seem to be very rare. And the best documented one, I think, would be the society which occupied the area of Rufisque in southern Senegal, where there's a section of the Serer population, and one among them said, we have no kings, no slaves. And that was in the context of resisting the slave raiding activities of local states. And I think I certainly buy that one. Otherwise, at the level of societies as a whole, I think it's very difficult to find any examples of cases where there were literally no slaves at any point. I mean, clearly, the export trade has a particular political economy rationale, that where you have, for example, the Kingdom of Benin in 1521, this was the kingdom that actually offered the Portuguese captives to buy, and they shipped them along the coast and sold them to what are now the southern Ghanaians, because this was before 1492. The Kingdom of Benin in 1521 forbade the export of male slaves. And it's probably no coincidence that over the next 400 years, although it survived until the late 19th century, it contracted hugely in size. I mean, as a competitive decision, that was a very risky one, because it did reduce your access to guns and indeed to horses from North Africa if your army was cavalry-based. And that doesn't apply to quite the same extent in terms of the internal competition. But I think that there was a very widespread acceptance of property rights in people. But as I say, that's not actually unusual. Of course, you could draw parallels, including with British society, perhaps not going quite as far.
Thank you. Domar seems to believe that his hypothesis applies equally to emancipation, to the abolition of slavery and serfdom as to its origins. And do you think that that would apply as well to West African slavery and the eventual demise?
I distinguish between the decision to prohibit slavery and the development of a free labour market that eventually replaces the slave labour market. The first, I think, was nothing to do with was not an induced institutional innovation. It was nothing to do with changing neighbour conditions. The problems the Europeans had was that they'd come in, pledged to abolish slavery. That was supposed to be one of their reasons why they were there. And of course, once on arrival, they realized if we do this, the economic consequences will be pretty disastrous. So notoriously, most colonial governments were extremely slow to abolish slavery. The French did in 1905, only when prompted by a mass walkout of slaves from certain towns in what is now Mali. In Sierra Leone, 1924, and so on. But there's a distinction between abolishing the legal status of slavery, meaning that a slave who runs away will not be returned to their owner, and even making slavery a crime, which usually didn't happen until the 20s or 30s, depending on the colony concerned, and actually seeing an alternative to slavery for former slaves and former masters. And for that, you had to wait until economic conditions changed. And I've argued that it was essentially the very uneven spread of profitable opportunities for cash crop production. So the neatest example is where you could grow cocoa. Cocoa being an exotic crop, only introduced in the late 19th century. But where you could grow cocoa. Cocoa plantations in Nigeria, just outside Lagos, began as slave plantations. Then the British abolished slavery. So they said, oh dear, and this is a good example of the Niebuhr rather than the Domar version. They then turned over to using pawn labour, and then the British got around to abolishing pawn labour, so they did switch to annual wage labour contracts, which for the whole of Nigeria were pioneered on those plantations. So I think in the end, changing economic conditions, they're not to do with the factor ratio as such. I mean, they're a little bit to do with it, but they're mainly to do with what you could grow. And if you could grow something for export, which you could produce by the characteristically efficient land extensive as opposed to land intensive methods of West Africa, then you could make that transition. If you couldn't, then very often either, to quote the Nigerian historian Ohedike, when the slaves left, the owners wept. Because he's describing a case where, according to him, the bourgeoisie basically disintegrated with abolition, and eventually a new bourgeoisie emerged who could pay their way. And on the other hand, you get cases such as Benedetta Rossi has described for an area of Niger where wage labour basically never became profitable up to more or less the present, so that aid agencies were resorting to basically saying, can we have a bit of forced labour here? You know, it's called communal labour, but please will you turn out, otherwise we can't get anything done. So I think that the Domar analysis does have a lot of explanatory power in the 20th century, but not in the quite the direct sense perhaps envisaged by the hypothesis.
Thank you very much, Gareth. Could we all thank Gareth again? And